The candle fell from Elara Whitmore's hand and hit the floor before she could stop it. The flame died at once, but the sound made the man sitting by the cold fireplace turn his head sharply toward her. She froze in the doorway, her heart pounding, certain she was about to lose her position on her very first night working in the private wing of Ashbourne Manor. "Who is there?" the voice said, low and rough, as if it had not been used in days. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Elara said quickly, bending to pick up the fallen candle. "I did not know you were still awake. I was told to check that the fires were out before I retired." Duke Julian Ashbourne did not answer right away. He sat in the near darkness of his study, a glass of brandy untouched on the table beside him, his shirt collar open, his eyes fixed on nothing at all. He looked less like the master of one of the largest estates in the county, and more like a man who had forgotten how to move forward with his own life. Elara had heard the stories from the other staff. A year ago, the Duke's wife, Duchess Cecilia, had died suddenly after a short illness, and the man who once filled this house with laughter had become a stranger even to himself. He rarely left his rooms except to walk the gardens alone at night. He had dismissed 3 housekeepers in the past year, each one unable to manage his temper or his silence. Elara had been warned before she even set foot inside his wing. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look him in the eye. Do not ask questions about the late Duchess. Above all, do not let him see that you pity him. She had planned to follow every one of these rules, but standing there in the dim light, watching him stare into an empty fireplace as though the world outside no longer existed, she found she could not simply walk away and pretend she had seen nothing. "You have not eaten today, Your Grace," she said quietly. The kitchen sent up a tray at noon. It came back untouched. He turned to look at her properly for the first time, and something in his expression shifted, as if he were surprised anyone had noticed such a small detail. "And what business is that of yours?" "None, sir. But an empty stomach makes for a heavier heart, my mother used to say, and you already carry enough weight without adding hunger to it." For a long moment, he only looked at her. She was young, perhaps 22, with dark hair pulled back neatly, and hands roughened from years of labor. She did not lower her gaze the way the other servants did. She simply waited, as though she expected him to either dismiss her or answer her, and either would be acceptable. "You are new," he said finally. "I began this morning, sir. I was told to assist in this wing since Mrs. Camden fell ill. And you are not afraid of me?" Elara considered the question honestly before answering, which surprised him more than the answer itself. "I do not think you are the kind of man who wishes to be feared, Your Grace. I think you are the kind of man who wishes to be left alone, and there is a difference between the two." He almost smiled. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him without trembling that he had nearly forgotten what honesty sounded like. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Miss Whitmore, Elara Whitmore." "Miss Whitmore," he repeated slowly, as though testing the shape of the name. "Bring the tray back up. I find I am hungry after all." It was a small thing, an ordinary exchange between a servant and her master, but it marked the beginning of something neither of them expected. Over the following days, Elara noticed that the Duke began appearing in places he had never gone before. He would walk past the small parlor where she mended linens and pause, as though about to say something, before continuing on. He began asking after her by name when he wanted his correspondence brought up, rather than simply ringing the bell and waiting for whichever maid answered. Mrs. Pembroke, the head housekeeper, noticed it too. She was a stern woman who had served the Ashbourne family for over 30 years, and very little escaped her attention. One afternoon she pulled Elara aside in the linen room, her arms crossed and her expression serious. "You have caught his eye," she said without preamble. "I do not know what you mean," Elara replied, though her cheeks had already gone warm. "Do not play the innocent with me, girl. I have served this family since before you were born, and I have seen what happens when a young maid becomes too familiar with the master of the house. It never ends well for the maid. Never. I have done nothing improper, Mrs. Pembroke. I am not accusing you of impropriety. I am warning you of danger. A duke does not marry a maid. He may admire her, he may even care for her in his own way, but in the end he will marry a lady of proper birth, and the maid will be left with nothing but a ruined reputation and a broken heart. I have seen it happen before, in this very house, to a girl no older than you." Elara wanted to argue, but she could not deny that the warning frightened her. She had grown up with nothing. Her parents had died when she was young, and she had worked her way up from the scullery to her current position, through nothing but hard labor and careful behavior. She could not afford to lose everything over foolish hopes. And yet, that evening, when the Duke asked her to read to him from a book of poetry because his eyes ached from too much correspondence, she found herself unable to refuse. She sat across from him in the study, reading aloud by candlelight, and for the first time in what felt like years, he laughed. It was a short laugh, almost rusty from disuse, but it was real, and it changed the entire shape of his face. "You have a talent for reading," he said. "You give the words feeling that I did not know they possessed." "My mother taught me to read before she passed," Elara said. "She said that words without feeling are just ink on a page. It was one of the few things she left me. I am sorry for your loss. As I am sorry for yours, Your Grace." He looked at her sharply, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped. No one spoke of the late Duchess in his presence, not even his own family. But instead of anger, she saw something closer to relief cross his features, as though he had been waiting for someone to finally acknowledge his grief instead of tiptoeing around it. "Everyone in this house treats her death like a subject too dangerous to touch," he said quietly. "They speak around it, never through it. You are the first person in a year who has simply said the words aloud. Grief does not disappear because we refuse to name it, Your Grace. It only grows heavier." He studied her for a long moment, and in that silence, something passed between them that neither of them could yet name. It was not romance, not in that first quiet evening. It was something smaller and perhaps more dangerous than romance. It was understanding. And understanding, Elara would come to learn, was far harder to walk away from than mere attraction. Outside the study door, unseen by either of them, a figure lingered in the shadows of the hallway. Lord Reginald Ashbourne, the Duke's cousin and closest living male relative, had come to the manor that evening under the excuse of discussing estate matters. He had heard the laughter coming from the study, faint but unmistakable, and it troubled him more than he wanted to admit. Reginald had spent the past year quietly preparing himself to inherit the dukedom. Julian had no children, no heir, and had shown no interest in remarrying or producing one. Reginald had convinced himself that it was only a matter of time before the title, the lands, and the wealth passed to him instead. He had already begun making small arrangements, subtle inquiries into the estate's finances, careful conversations with lawyers who handled matters of succession. He had told himself it was simply prudent planning, nothing more. But laughter changed things. Laughter meant healing, and a healed duke was a duke who might one day marry again, might one day have children of his own, might one day close the door on Reginald's careful plans entirely. He stood in the hallway a moment longer, listening to the low murmur of conversation from within the study, and then he turned and walked away, his mind already working through what he might do about this unexpected development. He did not yet know the maid's name, but he intended to find out. The following weeks brought small but steady changes to Ashbourne Manor. The Duke began taking his meals in the dining hall again, instead of alone in his rooms. He rode out to inspect the estate for the first time in months, meeting with his tenants and reviewing accounts that had been neglected since his wife's death. The staff, who had grown accustomed to walking on eggshells around him, began to relax, though none of them could quite say why the change had happened so suddenly. Elara told herself repeatedly that her role in his recovery was small, insignificant even. She was simply a maid who happened to be present during his darkest hours, nothing more. But she could not deny that he sought her out more often than could be explained by simple coincidence. He asked her opinion on matters no one else would have thought to ask a servant about. He requested she accompany him on short walks through the gardens, always with the excuse of needing someone to carry papers or take notes, though both of them knew the excuses grew thinner each time. One afternoon, as they walked along the garden path lined with late autumn roses, he stopped suddenly and turned to face her. "I have not felt like myself in over a year," he said, "not until recently." Elara's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I am glad to hear you are recovering, Your Grace. Do not call me that. Not out here, where no one else can hear. Call me Julian." "I could not possibly, sir. It would not be proper." "Nothing about the way I feel right now is entirely proper," he said, and there was something raw in his voice that made her breath catch. "I do not know what this is, Elara. I do not know what to call it, but I know that before you came into this house, I did not want to wake up in the mornings, and now I find myself looking forward to the smallest moments, simply because I know I might see you in them." She stood very still, unsure of what to say, torn between the warning Mrs. Pembroke had given her and the way her own heart was beating faster than she had ever known it could. "Your Grace, I am only a maid. Whatever this is, it cannot lead anywhere good. Your family, your title, your position in society, none of it allows for someone like me. And if I do not care about any of that, then you would be the first duke in history who did not," she said softly, and though it was meant as a gentle warning, it also carried a note of hope she could not quite hide. He reached out, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand near hers. Give me time, Ilara. That is all I ask. Give me time to prove that some things matter more than title and position. She did not answer him that day. She simply nodded, unable to trust her own voice, and walked back toward the house with her heart pounding and her mind racing with equal measures of fear and hope. She knew, even then, that whatever was beginning between them would not be simple, and it would not be without cost. But she also knew, deep down, that it was already too late to protect her heart from him. Behind the tall hedges at the edge of the garden, close enough to have heard every word, Lord Reginald stood with his jaw tight, and his mind already turning toward action. He had heard enough. It was time to move before this went any further, before a common maid found her way into a position she had no right to hold. He turned and walked briskly back toward the manor, already composing the letters he would send that very evening. Letters that would begin to unravel everything Julian and Ilara had only just begun to build. The night air had grown colder by the time Ilara made her way back to the servants' quarters, but she barely noticed the chill. Her mind was still on the garden, on the warmth of his hand so close to hers, on the words he had spoken that she knew she would replay in her thoughts long after she should have fallen asleep. For the first time since her parents had died, she allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she had always expected, a future where hard work and quiet endurance were not the only things waiting for her. But even as hope bloomed cautiously in her chest, a quieter fear settled beside it, the same fear Mrs. Pembroke had planted weeks before. Dukes did not marry maids. Whatever Julian felt for her now, in the privacy of a garden with no one watching, might not survive the weight of the world beyond Ashbourne Manor's walls. Society had rules, cruel and unyielding ones, and Ilara had seen enough of the world to know that rules like these rarely bent, no matter how sincere the feelings that pushed against them. She reached her small room at the end of the servants' hall and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the single candle flickering on the table beside her. Somewhere above her, in the grand rooms of the manor, the Duke was likely doing the same, staring at his own candle, wondering the same things she wondered. Two people from entirely different worlds, drawn together by grief and honesty, standing at the edge of something neither of them could yet name. Ilara did not know, as she finally closed her eyes that night, that beyond the manor walls, letters were already being written, plans already being set into motion, all designed to make certain that whatever was growing between her and the Duke would never be allowed to bloom. The letter arrived at the home of Baroness Winifred Halstead 3 days later, sealed with wax and marked urgent. Lord Reginald had chosen his words carefully, knowing that the Baroness was the most notorious gossip among the county's nobility, a woman who could spread a rumor across 3 counties before breakfast had ended. He did not accuse the Duke of anything improper outright. He simply mentioned in the gentlest and most concerned tone he could manage on paper that he feared for his cousin's judgment since a certain young maid had taken an unusual position of influence in his household. By the end of that week, the whispers had already begun to travel through the drawing rooms and dinner parties of the county's finest families. No one spoke of it directly to Julian, of course, but Ilara began to notice the change in how the other staff treated her. Some grew colder, distant, unwilling to meet her eyes in the hallways. Others watched her with a curiosity that felt uncomfortably close to judgment. Mrs. Pembroke found her one morning in the linen room, folding sheets with more force than the task required, her frustration evident in every sharp movement. "You have heard the talk," the housekeeper said, not unkindly. "I do not listen to gossip, Mrs. Pembroke. Whether you listen to it or not does not change whether it is spreading. Half the servants in this house believe you have set your sights on becoming the next Duchess. The other half believe you have already succeeded in becoming something far less respectable in his eyes." Ilara's hand stilled on the fabric. "None of it is true. I have done nothing improper. I believe you, child, but belief does not matter in matters like these. Perception is everything to people of that world, and once a rumor takes root, it grows regardless of what actually happened. You must be more careful, for your own sake." Ilara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that nothing had happened beyond conversation and quiet companionship, but the truth was more complicated than that, and she knew it. Something had happened between her and the Duke, something real, even if it had never crossed into anything improper. The problem was that in the eyes of society, closeness itself was the impropriety, regardless of what form it took. That evening, Julian summoned her to the study, and the moment she stepped inside, she could see that something had shifted in him. He stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense in a way she had not seen since those first weeks of his grief. "You have heard, then," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I have heard enough to know that my cousin has been busy," Julian replied, turning to face her. His expression was a mixture of anger and something closer to helplessness. Reginald has written to half the county, painting you as some scheming girl who has bewitched a grieving man into forgetting his duty. And do you believe him? Of course not. But belief is not the issue, Alara. The issue is that a title carries obligations, and society will not simply allow me to ignore those obligations because I have found someone who makes me feel like myself again for the first time in a year. He crossed the room and stood before her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of a battle he had not chosen to fight. I will not let him ruin this. I will not let him take away the one good thing that has happened to me since Cecilia died. Julian, she said, using his name for the first time without hesitation. You cannot simply wish away the rules of your world. I am a maid, you are a duke. Whatever Reginald says, the truth remains that our positions are impossible to reconcile, no matter how either of us feels. Nothing is impossible unless we allow it to be, he said firmly. I have spent a year letting grief dictate my life. I will not now let fear do the same. Before she could respond, a soft knock interrupted them, and a young footman entered with an apologetic look, informing the Duke that a visitor had arrived unannounced. Julian's jaw tightened when he heard the name. Lord Reginald had come to the manor himself. Reginald was shown into the study moments later, his expression carefully composed into one of polite concern, though Alara could see the calculation behind his eyes the moment he looked at her. He bowed slightly to Julian before addressing him directly, as though Alara were not even present in the room. Cousin, I hope you will forgive the unannounced visit, but I felt it necessary to speak with you in person. There is talk circulating through the county that concerns me greatly, talk regarding your household staff, and I did not wish for you to hear it secondhand from strangers rather than from family. I am well aware of the talk, Reginald, and I am equally aware of its source, Julian said, his voice cold in a way Alara had never heard him use before. You have taken it upon yourself to spread rumors about a member of my household staff, based on nothing more than baseless speculation. I have spread nothing but concern for your reputation, and the reputation of this family, Reginald replied smoothly. You are the Duke of Ashbourne, cousin. Your actions reflect not only on yourself but on the entire family line. Surely you can understand why others might find it troubling that a maid has been given such unusual privileges within your household. What I find troubling, Julian said, stepping closer to his cousin, is a man who claims concern for family while quietly positioning himself to inherit everything, should that family fail to produce an heir. Do not think I have not noticed your inquiries into the estate's succession, Reginald. Do not think I do not understand exactly what motivates your sudden interest in my personal affairs. Reginald's composure flickered for just a moment before he restored it, his smile thin and cold. I only wish to protect this family's legacy, Julian. If that makes me your enemy, then I am sorry to hear it. But mark my words, cousin, the world will not allow you to simply do as you please without consequence. A duke who marries beneath his station brings shame upon generations of his family name. I would think carefully before you allow whatever this is. He glanced briefly, dismissively, toward Alara, to become something you cannot undo. He left shortly after, and the room felt colder for his absence, as though his very presence had drained the warmth from the air. Julian stood in silence for a long moment, before finally turning back to Alara, his expression a mixture of fury and determination. I am sorry you had to witness that, he said quietly. He is not entirely wrong, Julian. There are consequences to what is happening between us. Consequences that will fall far harder on me than on you. You will remain a duke regardless of what happens. I could lose everything. My position, my reputation, my ability to find honest work anywhere in this county ever again. Then let me protect you from that, he said, taking a step closer. Let me prove that what is happening between us is worth the risk. She wanted so desperately to believe him, to let herself fall completely into the hope he offered, but years of hardship had taught her caution above all else. And caution was not easily abandoned, no matter how tempting the alternative appeared. The weeks that followed brought a strange and uneasy calm to the manor, though Alara could sense it was merely the quiet before a storm neither of them could yet see clearly. Julian threw himself into estate matters with renewed energy, determined to prove to his tenants, his staff, and perhaps to himself, that he was capable of managing his responsibilities despite the personal turmoil surrounding him. He consulted with lawyers regarding matters of inheritance, quietly working to close whatever loopholes his cousin might exploit should he ever attempt to challenge Julian's authority or legitimacy as head of the family. Alara, meanwhile, tried to return to her duties as though nothing had changed, though everyone in the household could see that something fundamental had shifted. She continued her work diligently, avoiding unnecessary contact with the Duke in front of other staff members, trying desperately to protect what little reputation she had left. But in quiet moments, stolen between duties, In the garden at dusk or the study late at night, the connection between them only continued to deepen. One evening, as autumn gave way to the first cold breath of winter, Julian found her in the small library on the manor's ground floor, where she had been sent to retrieve a book for one of the guest rooms. He entered quietly, closing the door behind him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I received a letter today," he finally said, "from an old family friend, the Countess of Ravensworth. She wrote to inform me, quite delicately, that several families with eligible daughters have begun making inquiries about my availability for marriage. It seems my recovery from grief has not gone unnoticed, and the vultures of society have decided it is time for me to remarry appropriately." Alara's chest tightened at his words, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "That is to be expected, is it not? You are a duke without an heir. Society will always press you toward marriage that serves the family's interests." "I have no interest in marrying for the sake of society's expectations," he said, moving closer to her. "I have already found the person I wish to marry, if she will have me." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything either of them had spoken before. Alara felt her breath catch entirely, torn between overwhelming hope and the crushing weight of everything that stood against them. "Julian, you cannot mean that. You know what it would cost you. Your family's acceptance, your standing among your peers, perhaps even your ability to govern the estate effectively if the nobility turns against you entirely. I have already lost so much in this life, Alara. I lost my parents young. I lost Cecilia far too soon. I spent a year lost within my own grief, unable to see any path forward. And then you walked into my life, not with pity, not with careful words meant to spare my feelings, but with honesty and warmth that reminded me what it felt like to actually live, rather than simply exist. I am not willing to lose that too, not for the sake of appearances, not for the comfort of people who have never once cared whether I was truly happy." She felt tears gathering, though she fought to keep them from falling. "What if it is not enough, Julian? What if love, however real, cannot overcome everything standing against us? Then we will find out together," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand for the first time, without hesitation, without pretense of some practical excuse. "But I refuse to let fear decide our future before we have even had the chance to fight for it." In that quiet library, surrounded by the smell of old books and the soft glow of a single lamp, something settled between them that neither rumor nor cousin nor society's rigid expectations could easily unmake. But even as hope took firmer root in Alara's heart, she could not shake the feeling that the true battle had not yet begun, and that Reginald, having failed once, would not simply retreat and accept defeat so easily. She was right to feel that unease. Even as she and Julian stood together in the library, unaware of anything beyond the walls of that quiet room, Lord Reginald sat in his own study several miles away, a letter half finished on the desk before him, addressed to a private investigator, known for uncovering secrets that families desperately wished to keep hidden. If rumor alone would not be enough to separate the Duke from his maid, Reginald intended to find something far more damaging, something that would leave Julian no choice but to end the connection entirely, whether he wished to or not. Winter settled over Ashbourne Manor, with a bitterness that matched the tension quietly building within its walls. Snow covered the gardens where Julian and Alara had once walked freely, and the cold seemed to seep into every corner of the house, though the true chill had little to do with the weather outside. Reginald had not returned to the manor since his confrontation with Julian, but his absence brought no comfort. Alara knew, as did Julian, that silence from a man like Reginald rarely meant surrender. It meant planning. The private investigator Reginald had hired was a man named Mr. Halloway, known throughout London for his discretion and his ability to uncover secrets that families would pay handsomely to keep buried. Reginald had given him one task: to learn everything possible about Alara Whitmore, her family, her past, anything that might be used to discredit her or force her from the Duke's household permanently. It did not take Halloway long to find what he needed. Alara's father, it turned out, had not simply died of illness as she had always believed. Records showed that he had left behind significant debts before his death, debts that had gone unpaid and had technically been inherited by his surviving family, though Alara herself had never been informed of their existence, having been only a child when he passed. Under the strictest interpretation of the law, this meant that Alara herself, upon reaching adulthood, had unknowingly become responsible for obligations she knew nothing about. It was not the kind of secret that would ruin her socially on its own. Debt was common enough among the lower classes, and no one would think less of a maid for her father's financial failures. But Reginald did not intend to use the information so simply. He intended to twist it, to present it in the worst possible light, suggesting that Alara had deliberately hidden her family's disgrace, that she was, in fact, a fortune hunter who had calculated every step of her relationship with the Duke in hopes of escaping her inherited debts through marriage to a wealthy man. It was a lie built on a fragment of truth, which made it all the more dangerous. Reginald wasted no time putting his plan into motion. He arranged for the information to reach the ears of several prominent families throughout the county, carefully framing it not as fact but as troubling rumor, always careful to protect himself from any accusation of deliberate slander. Within days, the story had transformed and grown with each retelling, until it bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. By the time it reached the servants' quarters of Ashbourne Manor, the tale being whispered was that Alara Whitmore came from a family of criminals, that her father had died owing money to dangerous men, and that she had schemed her way into the Duke's household with the sole purpose of securing his fortune for herself. Alara first heard the full extent of the rumors from a young kitchen maid named Grace, who approached her with tears in her eyes, clearly torn between loyalty and fear of associating with someone whose reputation had become so thoroughly tarnished. "They are saying terrible things about you," Grace whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of being seen speaking to her at all. "That your father was a criminal, that you have been planning this from the moment you arrived, that you are only after the Duke's money. None of it is true, Grace. My father died of illness. I knew nothing of any debts until this very moment. I believe you, truly I do. But others do not, and Mrs. Pembroke says the housekeeper of Ravensworth Hall has already dismissed a maid simply for having once spoken kindly of you in passing conversation. People are frightened, Ilara. Frightened of being connected to whatever is happening here." The weight of the accusation settled over Ilara like a physical burden, heavier than anything she had carried before. She had spent her entire life building a reputation of honesty and diligence, working twice as hard as anyone else, simply to prove that her humble origins did not define her worth. To have that reputation destroyed in the span of a single week, based on lies twisted from a fragment of truth she had not even known existed, felt like watching everything she had built crumble to dust before her eyes. She found Julian in his study that evening, and the moment he saw her face, he knew something terrible had happened. She told him everything, her voice trembling despite her attempts to remain composed, and watched as his expression shifted from confusion to understanding, to a barely restrained fury that frightened her slightly, though she knew the anger was not directed at her. "This is Reginald's doing," he said, his hands clenched at his sides. "There is no other explanation. No one else would have any reason to dig into your family's private affairs. Even if it is his doing, Julian, the damage has already been done. People believe what they wish to believe, and right now they wish to believe I am some scheming criminal's daughter who seduced a grieving duke for his fortune. That belief will not simply disappear because the truth is more complicated. Then we will make the truth known. I will speak to every family who has heard these lies and explain the situation myself. And what good will that do? A duke defending his maid's honor will only feed the rumors further, not extinguish them. Every word you speak in my defense will be twisted into further proof that something improper exists between us." She sank into the chair across from his desk, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Perhaps Mrs. Pembroke was right from the very beginning. Perhaps this was doomed from the moment it began. "Do not say that," Julian said sharply, kneeling before her chair so that their eyes met directly. "Do not let him win simply by making the fight difficult. I have watched you face far worse than gossip, with more courage than most men I have known. I refuse to believe you would surrender now. It is not surrender, Julian. It is survival. I have nothing to fall back on if this goes wrong. No family fortune, no other position waiting for me, nothing but my reputation, and that is precisely what is being destroyed." He took her hands in his expression softening even as determination remained clear in his eyes. "Then let me be your fallback. Let me be the family you no longer have, the security you have never been given the chance to possess. I know I cannot undo what Reginald has done, but I can promise you this. Whatever happens next, you will not face it alone." The following days brought no relief from the growing scandal, but they did bring a change in Julian's approach. Rather than confronting the rumors directly, which Alara had rightly pointed out would only worsen matters, he began quietly investigating the source of the information himself, determined to expose Reginald's involvement beyond any doubt. He wrote to contacts in London, men who owed him favors from years of business dealings, asking them to look into any recent inquiries made regarding the Whitmore family's financial history. It took nearly 2 weeks, but the information eventually came back confirming exactly what Julian had suspected. Mr. Halloway, the investigator responsible for uncovering Alara's family history, had been paid directly by Lord Reginald Ashbourne, with records of the transaction clearly documented through the investigator's own ledgers, which one of Julian's contacts had managed to review discreetly. Armed with this proof, Julian felt a surge of hope for the first time since the scandal had begun. But before he could decide how best to use this information, a far more dangerous development arrived, one that neither he nor Alara had anticipated. Alara received a summons one morning, delivered by a stern-faced solicitor who arrived at the manor claiming to represent creditors seeking repayment of her late father's debts. The amount demanded was substantial, far beyond anything Alara could ever hope to earn as a maid, and the solicitor made it clear that failure to address the debt promptly could result in serious legal consequences, potentially including imprisonment for debt, a fate that still existed for those unable to satisfy their financial obligations under the law. Alara stood frozen in the manor's entrance hall, the solicitor's papers trembling in her hands, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to lead toward disaster. She had no money to pay such a debt. She had no family to turn to for assistance. And the timing of this sudden demand, arriving so soon after Reginald's rumors had begun circulating, seemed far too convenient to be mere coincidence. When Julian found her, still standing in the hall with the papers clutched tightly in her hands, he immediately understood that something had gone terribly wrong. "They intend to have me imprisoned if the debt is not paid within a month," Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper, the shock of the situation still settling over her. "I do not understand how this happened so suddenly. This debt has existed for years without any collector ever pursuing it, and now, within weeks of Reginald's rumors, someone demands immediate repayment." Julian took the papers from her hands, scanning them quickly, his expression darkening with each line he read. "This is Reginald's doing as well. I would stake my entire fortune on it. He has purchased your father's debt from whatever creditor originally held it, and is now using it as a weapon to force you from this household, one way or another. Can he do that? Can a person simply purchase someone else's debt for the purpose of destroying them? Legally, yes, though it is a cruel and calculated maneuver. Precisely the kind of thing Reginald has proven himself capable of." Julian's jaw tightened as he set the papers down on a nearby table. "But he has made one critical mistake in doing so. He has given me a clear and undeniable connection between himself and this entire scheme, one I intend to use against him. Julian, I cannot simply wait while you plan a counterattack. If this debt is not paid within a month, I could be imprisoned. I need a solution now, not eventually." "Then the solution is simple," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "I will pay the debt myself, immediately, in full." Alara shook her head firmly. "I cannot allow that. It would only feed further into the very rumors Reginald has spread, proof in everyone's eyes that I sought you out specifically for your wealth. I do not care what proof it provides to gossiping strangers who have never once tried to understand the truth of our situation. I care about ensuring you are safe, Alara. Beyond that, nothing else matters to me." Despite her protests, Julian proceeded to arrange payment of the debt that very afternoon, working with his own solicitor to ensure the transaction was handled swiftly and thoroughly, leaving no room for further legal complications. When the payment was confirmed and the immediate threat of imprisonment eliminated, Alara felt a wave of relief wash over her, though it was quickly followed by renewed anxiety regarding what this latest development might mean for their already precarious situation. That evening, as they sat together in the study, both exhausted from the stress of the day's events, Alara finally allowed herself to voice the fear that had been building within her for weeks. "Julian, I fear this will never end. Reginald will simply continue finding new ways to attack us, new schemes to separate us or destroy my reputation entirely. How long can we continue fighting battles like this one before something breaks beyond repair?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled softly in the hearth before them. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "But I know that surrendering now, allowing fear to win, simply because the fight has proven difficult, would be a far greater tragedy than any battle Reginald could wage against us. I have already lost too much in this life to grief and circumstances beyond my control. I refuse to lose you to the schemes of a man motivated purely by greed. And if his schemes eventually succeed regardless of our efforts, then at least we will know we fought for something worth fighting for, rather than surrendering to fear before the battle had even truly begun." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand gently in his own. "I meant what I said before, Alara. I intend to marry you, regardless of what obstacles Reginald places in our path. The only question that remains is whether you are willing to face those obstacles alongside me." Alara looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation, and found none. Whatever fear still lingered within her heart, she could not deny the strength of what had grown between them over these past difficult months. Strength forged not through comfort and ease, but through shared hardship and unwavering honesty. "I am willing," she said finally, her voice steady despite the uncertainty of everything that still lay ahead. "Whatever comes next, I am willing to face it beside you." Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment of renewed determination, that Reginald's most dangerous move had not yet been played, and that the coming weeks would test their resolve in ways far more severe than anything they had yet endured. Reginald received word of the paid debt within days, delivered by his own network of informants scattered throughout the county's servant quarters and legal offices. He sat in his study staring at the letter that confirmed his failure, a cold fury settling over him that he had not felt since the earliest days of his campaign against the maid who had disrupted his carefully laid plans. 2 attempts had failed now, the rumors and the debt, and each failure only strengthened the bond between Julian and Alara, rather than breaking it apart as he had intended. He understood now that subtlety would no longer serve his purposes. If whispered rumors and financial pressure could not separate them, he would need to strike more directly, forcing a confrontation that would leave Julian with no choice but to abandon whatever future he imagined with the maid, regardless of his personal feelings on the matter. Reginald began composing a new letter that evening, this one addressed not to gossiping baronesses or debt collectors, but to the Ashbourne family's most senior relative, the elderly Dowager Duchess Margaret, Julian's own grandmother, who resided at a family estate 2 counties away and held considerable influence over matters of family honor and reputation. If anyone possessed the authority to force Julian's hand, it was the woman who had raised him after his own parents had died when he was still a boy. The Dowager Duchess arrived at Ashbourne Manor less than a week later, her carriage pulling up the long drive with an air of formality that immediately set the entire household on edge. Alara watched from an upper window as the elderly woman emerged, dressed in black silk despite the fact that she had not worn mourning colors in over a decade, her posture rigid with the kind of authority that came from a lifetime spent commanding respect from everyone around her. Julian met his grandmother in the entrance hall, and though Alara could not hear their initial exchange, she could see from the window that the conversation was tense from the very first moment. The Dowager Duchess did not embrace her grandson warmly as family members typically might after a lengthy absence. Instead, she stood stiffly, her expression severe, clearly a woman who had traveled a considerable distance for a specific and unpleasant purpose. Alara was summoned to the drawing room an hour later, and she entered with her heart pounding, aware that whatever conversation awaited her would likely determine the course of everything that had happened between her and Julian over these past difficult months. The Dowager Duchess sat in the room's finest chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, studying Alara with an appraising gaze that made her feel as though she were being measured and found wanting before a single word had even been spoken. "So this is the young woman who has caused such considerable disruption within my grandson's household," the Dowager Duchess said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are younger than the rumors suggested, though I suppose that matters little in the grand scheme of things." "Your Grace," Alara said, offering a proper curtsy despite the trembling in her legs, "I do not know what you have heard, but I assure you that nothing improper has occurred between myself and the Duke. I did not travel 2 counties to discuss propriety, girl. I traveled here because my grandson has apparently decided to throw away every advantage of his birth and position for the sake of infatuation with a servant, and I intend to understand exactly what has driven him to such foolishness before I allow it to continue any further." Julian, who had entered the room during this exchange, stepped forward immediately, his expression tight with barely controlled frustration. "Grandmother, this is not infatuation. I have given this matter considerable thought over these past months, and my feelings for Alara are neither sudden nor foolish." "Feelings," the Dowager Duchess repeated, as though the word itself was distasteful to her. "Julian, you are the Duke of Ashbourne. You carry the weight of centuries of family legacy on your shoulders, a legacy that requires marriage to someone of appropriate birth, someone capable of navigating the complex world of society and politics that comes with your position. Feelings, however genuine, cannot substitute for these practical realities. Cecilia was chosen for exactly those practical reasons," Julian said, his voice rising slightly with an edge of pain that Alara had not heard him express since those earliest nights of grief she had witnessed. "A marriage arranged for the good of the family, appropriate in every way society demanded, and when she died, I discovered that appropriateness means nothing when the person beside you has never truly understood who you are beneath your title. Alara has given me something Cecilia's careful, practical arrangement never could. She has given me honesty and companionship and a reason to want to continue living rather than simply existing beneath the weight of my responsibilities." The Dowager Duchess's expression flickered slightly at this, a brief crack in her stern composure that suggested his words had affected her more than she wished to reveal. But she quickly restored her rigid posture, unwilling to abandon her position so easily. "Even if everything you say is true, Julian, the practical realities remain unchanged. If you marry this girl, you will face rejection from nearly every family in society. Your ability to conduct business, to secure advantageous marriages for any future children, to maintain the family's standing among the nobility, all of it will suffer tremendously. Have you considered what such consequences would mean, not simply for yourself, but for the entire Ashbourne legacy that generations before you worked so tirelessly to build? Ilara, who had remained silent through much of this exchange, finally found her voice. Your Grace, if I may speak honestly, I have asked myself these very questions countless times since this situation began. I have wondered whether my presence in Julian's life causes more harm than good, whether the cost to his family and his position is simply too great to justify whatever happiness we might find together. I do not have easy answers to these questions, but I know this. Julian was a broken man when I first met him, lost so deeply within his grief that he had stopped truly living entirely. Whatever else may be said about me, about my origins or my lack of proper birth, I did not create that brokenness, and I have done everything within my power to help heal it, not through scheming or manipulation, but simply through honest care for another human being's well-being. The Dowager Duchess studied her for a long moment, something calculating and thoughtful behind her sharp eyes. You speak well for a maid, she said finally, though the words carried less hostility than before. Tell me, girl, what do you know of Lord Reginald's involvement in the difficulties you have faced these past months? Ilara glanced toward Julian, uncertain how much had already been shared, before answering carefully. We believe he has orchestrated much of the recent trouble, Your Grace. The rumors regarding my family, the sudden demand for repayment of debts I did not even know existed, all of it traces back to inquiries made under his direction. The Dowager Duchess's expression hardened once again, though this time the anger seemed directed elsewhere entirely. I have long suspected that Reginald possessed ambitions beyond what family loyalty should permit. If what you say is true, this changes matters considerably. She rose from her chair, moving toward the window with the measured pace of someone lost deeply in thought. I did not travel here today intending to be swayed by sentiment, Julian. I came prepared to insist that you end this connection entirely for the sake of family honor. But honor built upon another family member's dishonest scheming is no honor at all. Then you will not stand against us, Julian said, hope evident in his voice for the first time since his grandmother's arrival. I did not say that, the Dowager Duchess replied sharply, turning back to face them both. I said this changes matters considerably, not that my concerns have vanished entirely. Marriage to a maid, regardless of the circumstances that brought you together, will still carry consequences you cannot fully escape, Julian. Society will still judge, families will still whisper, and some doors will close to you regardless of how sympathetic your story may sound within these walls. I have seen what happens to families who defy convention, even for reasons that seem justified in the moment. I understand the risks, grandmother. I have understood them from the very beginning of this situation, but I have made my decision, and no amount of social consequence will change my mind. I would rather face a lifetime of closed doors alongside someone who understands me completely than spend my remaining years surrounded by society's approval while feeling as hollow and lost as I did during that first year after Cecilia's death. The Dowager Duchess was silent for a long moment, studying her grandson with an expression that mixed frustration with something that might have been reluctant respect. You have always possessed your grandfather's stubbornness, she said finally. He too defied convention once, though the circumstances were quite different. I did not approve of his decision at the time either, and yet our marriage proved happier than many arranged unions I witnessed throughout my life. Does that mean you will support us, Your Grace? Ilara asked carefully, hardly daring to hope. It means I will not stand in your way, though support is perhaps too strong a word for what I currently feel, the Dowager Duchess replied. I will need time to consider how best to address Reginald's involvement in this scheme, and I expect both of you to conduct yourselves with appropriate discretion until matters can be properly resolved. But I will not travel back to my estate today, intent on forbidding a union I now understand to be built on something more substantial than mere infatuation. It was not the enthusiastic blessing either of them might have hoped for, but it was far more than either had expected when the Dowager Duchess first arrived with her stern expression and severe black silk. As she prepared to depart later that afternoon, she paused before Ilara one final time, her expression unreadable. You have shown considerable courage throughout this conversation, girl, courage that many women of proper birth might have lacked when faced with my scrutiny. Perhaps my grandson has chosen more wisely than I initially believed possible. She turned to leave, then paused once more. Regarding Reginald, I intend to make inquiries of my own into his recent activities. A man willing to manufacture false debts and spread malicious rumors against an innocent woman, is not a man who should ever inherit the responsibilities of this family, regardless of his position in the line of succession. Leave him to me for now, Julian. I have my own methods of dealing with family members who forget their place." After she departed, Julian and Alara stood together in the entrance hall, both slightly stunned by how the confrontation had ultimately resolved itself. "I did not expect that outcome," Julian admitted, a smile beginning to spread across his face for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Nor did I," Alara replied, relief flooding through her entire body. "Though I suspect Reginald will not simply retreat quietly once he learns of your grandmother's involvement." "No," Julian agreed, his expression sobering slightly. "He will not. But for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I feel confident that we possess the strength to face whatever he attempts next, together, without fear dictating our choices." Little did they know, Reginald had already begun planning his most desperate and dangerous scheme yet, one that would force a final confrontation neither of them could have fully anticipated, testing not only their resolve but the very foundation of everything they had built together over these past turbulent months. Reginald learned of the Dowager Duchess's visit within days, and the news struck him with far greater force than either the failed rumors or the failed debt scheme before it. If his own grandmother had chosen to side, however cautiously, with Julian and the Maid, then Reginald understood that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Desperation began to creep into his calculations, pushing him toward increasingly reckless decisions that a more patient man might have avoided entirely. He arrived at Ashbourne Manor unannounced once again, but this time his demeanor carried none of the polished, careful concern he had displayed during his previous visits. He strode into the manor with barely restrained anger, demanding an immediate audience with Julian, brushing past the footman who attempted to announce him properly. Julian met him in the great hall rather than the study, sensing that whatever conversation was about to unfold required witnesses rather than privacy. Several members of the household staff, including Mrs. Pembroke and Alara herself, remained nearby, drawn by the commotion of Reginald's dramatic arrival. "You went to my grandmother," Reginald said without preamble, his voice tight with fury. "You turned her against me, poisoned her mind with accusations before I could even defend myself." "I did not need to poison anyone's mind, Reginald," Julian replied evenly, though Alara could see the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior. "The evidence of your scheming speaks quite clearly for itself. The investigator you hired, the debt you purchased and weaponized against an innocent woman, all of it traces back directly to your own actions." "Everything I have done has been for the good of this family," Reginald insisted, his composure cracking further with each word. "You would throw away centuries of legacy for the sake of a maid's pretty face, and I am the villain for attempting to prevent such foolishness? You are the villain for manufacturing lies, for purchasing debts specifically designed to have an innocent woman imprisoned, for spreading rumors calculated to destroy a reputation she spent her entire life building through honest labor," Julian said, his voice growing harder with each accusation. "Do not dress your ambition in the false clothing of family loyalty, Reginald. We both know precisely what motivated your actions these past months." Reginald's face reddened with a mixture of anger and something closer to panic, as he realized how thoroughly his schemes had been uncovered. "You cannot prove any connection between myself and these events," he said, though his voice carried far less conviction than his words attempted to project. "Actually, I can," Julian replied, withdrawing a folded document from within his coat and holding it out toward his cousin. "This is a sworn statement from Mr. Halloway, the investigator you hired, detailing every payment you made and every instruction you provided regarding the investigation into Alara's family history. My grandmother's own solicitors obtained this statement earlier this week, along with documentation proving your purchase of the debt used to threaten Alara with imprisonment." Reginald stared at the document without taking it, his expression shifting rapidly between disbelief and dawning horror as he understood the full extent of what had been uncovered. Halloway would not betray a client's confidence so easily. "Perhaps not for mere payment," Julian said. "But when my grandmother's solicitors explained the potential legal consequences of his involvement in a scheme to fabricate evidence and manipulate legitimate debt collection processes for personal gain, he found himself considerably more willing to cooperate with our inquiries." The color drained entirely from Reginald's face as the weight of his situation became fully apparent. "What do you intend to do with this information?" "What do you intends entirely on you," Julian replied. "My grandmother has already begun the process of formally removing you from the line of succession, a decision she reached independently after reviewing the evidence herself. Whether this matter proceeds further, into the realm of legal consequences for your actions against Alara specifically, depends on whether you choose to cause any further trouble for either of us moving forward." "You would ruin your own cousin's future entirely," Reginald said, though the fight had largely drained from his voice, replaced by something closer to desperate calculation. You attempted to ruin an innocent woman's future through lies and manufactured debt, Reginald. I would say the consequences you now face are considerably milder than what you attempted to inflict upon her. Julian's expression softened slightly, though his resolve remained unshaken. I do not wish to see you imprisoned or entirely destroyed. You are still family, despite everything that has happened. But you will cease your interference in my life immediately, and you will issue a formal statement to every family you spread rumors to, correcting the record regarding Alara's character and her family's history. Reginald stood silent for a long moment, clearly searching for some remaining avenue of resistance and finding none available to him. Finally, his shoulders sagged with the weight of complete defeat. And if I comply with these demands, then this matter ends here, quietly, without further legal consequence beyond your removal from the succession, which my grandmother has already determined is warranted, regardless of what else transpires between us today. Reginald left the manor shortly after, his earlier arrogance replaced entirely by the quiet devastation of a man who had gambled everything on a scheme that ultimately cost him far more than he had ever intended to risk. Alara watched him go from her position near the staircase, feeling not triumph exactly, but a profound sense of relief that the danger threatening her future had finally, truly passed. Julian found her there moments later, his expression exhausted but unmistakably lighter than it had been in weeks. It is over, he said simply, taking her hands in his. Truly over this time. I still cannot quite believe it, Alara admitted, tears gathering in her eyes despite her attempts to remain composed. After everything these past months, the rumors, the debt, your grandmother's visit, I had begun to fear this moment might never arrive. I never doubted it would, Julian said, though the slight tremor in his own voice suggested he had experienced far more uncertainty than his words implied. Not because I possessed some special confidence that everything would work out perfectly, but because I refused to imagine a future that did not include you in it, regardless of how difficult the path toward that future proved to be. News of Reginald's disgrace and removal from the succession spread through the county nearly as quickly as his original rumors had, though this time the story worked entirely in Alara's favor. Families who had previously whispered about her supposed scheming now spoke instead of Lord Reginald's manipulative ambition, and the Duke's unwavering loyalty toward a woman who had apparently helped guide him through the darkest period of his life. The correction, while not erasing every trace of doubt that had settled into certain corners of society, did enough to restore Alara's reputation sufficiently that Julian felt confident proceeding openly with his intentions. He proposed to her 3 weeks later, in the very garden where he had first confessed his growing feelings months earlier, though this time the late winter roses had given way to the first tentative signs of spring pushing through the soil. He knelt before her without hesitation, without concern for who might witness the moment, and asked her to become his wife with words far simpler and more heartfelt than any formal declaration society might have expected from a man of his position. I do not offer you a fairy tale, Alara, he said, holding her hands as he knelt in the damp garden soil. I offer you a life that will likely still include whispers and judgment from certain corners of society, a life where some doors may remain permanently closed to us both, but I also offer you honesty and partnership, and a love that has been tested through genuine hardship, rather than simply assumed through convenient circumstances. Will you marry me? Alara did not hesitate before answering, all her earlier caution and fear finally giving way entirely to the certainty that had been building within her heart for months. Yes, she said, pulling him up to stand before her. Yes, Julian, I will marry you. The wedding itself was smaller than most society weddings, held quietly at Ashbourne Manor with only close family and trusted friends in attendance, precisely as Julian and Alara had wished. The Dowager Duchess attended, her stern expression softened considerably by evident approval, having grown genuinely fond of Alara during the months since their difficult first meeting. Mrs. Pembroke stood among the assembled guests as well, tears in her eyes despite her earlier warnings about the dangers of hoping for such an outcome, proud beyond words to witness the young maid she had once cautioned rise to become the manor's new Duchess. As Alara walked down the aisle in a simple but elegant gown, passing rows of household staff who had once served alongside her and now watched her transformation with a mixture of joy and quiet wonder, she felt none of the discomfort she might have expected from such a dramatic shift in circumstance. She remained, in her heart, the same woman who had once folded linens and mended sheets, who had spoken honestly to a grieving duke when others feared to approach him at all. Her new title changed her circumstances, but it did not change who she fundamentally was. Julian watched her approach with an expression of pure joy that stood in stark contrast to the broken, grieving man he had been when she first entered his household. The year of darkness that had once seemed permanent had given way entirely to genuine happiness, built not on the foundation of appropriate social arrangement, but on honest connection between two people who had found each other through circumstances neither could have anticipated. In the months that followed their marriage, Elara settled into her new role as Duchess of Ashbourne, with the same quiet diligence and honest warmth that had first drawn Julian's attention during her earliest days as his household maid. She did not forget where she had come from, often finding herself in the kitchen speaking with the very staff she had once worked alongside, treating them with a respect and familiarity that most duchesses of her position would never have considered appropriate. Under her influence, the household staff found themselves treated with unprecedented consideration, their concerns heard and addressed by a mistress who understood intimately what it meant to labor without recognition or reward. Reginald, true to his word, disappeared from their lives almost entirely following his public correction of the rumors he had spread, eventually settling in a distant county, where his connection to the Ashbourne family name carried far less weight and consequence. Julian occasionally received word of his cousin's activities through mutual acquaintances, but the bitter rivalry that had once threatened to destroy everything he and Elara had built together gradually faded into distant memory, overshadowed entirely by the happiness that had grown to fill Ashbourne Manor in its place. On a warm evening nearly a year after their wedding, Julian found Elara in the same garden where he had once knelt to propose, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. He joined her quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently against her shoulder as they watched the light fade together. "Do you ever think back to that first night?" he asked softly, "when you found me drinking alone in the study, refusing to accept comfort from anyone around me?" "Often," Elara admitted, leaning back against him comfortably. "I think of how frightened I was that I had already lost my position before I had even truly begun it, and how strange it feels now to consider how differently everything unfolded." "I think of it often as well," Julian said. "I think of how close I came to remaining lost within that grief forever, had you simply followed Mrs. Pembroke's instructions and left me alone with my brandy and my sorrow that night, rather than speaking to me with the honesty no one else dared offer. You would have found your way eventually, Julian. You are stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, turning her gently to face him. "But I am grateful beyond words that I did not have to find that strength alone. You saved me from a darkness I feared I would never escape, Elara, and you did it not through grand gestures or calculated ambition, but simply through the honest kindness of a maid who refused to walk past a grieving man without offering him comfort." She smiled up at him, the last light of sunset catching in her eyes, and felt an overwhelming gratitude for the strange, difficult, ultimately beautiful path that had led her from a life of quiet servitude to this moment, standing beside a man who had healed alongside her, rather than simply because of her. Their story had never been a simple one, marked by rumors and manufactured debts and the desperate schemes of a jealous relative, but perhaps that difficulty had only made the outcome more meaningful, proof that genuine love, tested thoroughly by hardship, could still emerge stronger and more certain on the other side. She had been only a maid when she first walked through the doors of Ashbourne Manor, uncertain of her place in a world that had given her little beyond hard work and quiet endurance. She stood now as its Duchess, not because circumstance had simply favored her, but because she had faced every obstacle placed before her with honesty and courage, refusing to let fear or society's rigid expectations determine the course of her own heart. And as she stood in that garden beside the man she loved, watching the last light of day give way gently to the promise of another beginning, she understood completely that some transformations, however unlikely they might once have seemed, were simply meant to be.